Welcome to the Retail Media Moguls podcast, brought to you by Platform 195. We share trends and strategies across retail media to help you accelerate your brand growth. I'm your host, Stuart Adamson. Welcome to the Retail Media Moguls podcast. I'm your host, Stuart Adamson, founder and CEO of Platform 195. Today, I'm delighted to be joined by Colin Lewis, a seasoned marketeer with over 25 years of hands-on international experience. Colin is a multi-award-winning marketer, renowned speaker and consultant who is currently serving as an advisor at Grace & Co. With his extensive portfolio, Colin brings a wealth of insight from his roles at notable brands. And beyond his corporate roles, Colin is a prolific writer and thought leader, having contributed to Marketing Week magazine since 2016, where he shares his insights on marketing trends, strategies, and the future of the field. And as an educator, he significantly contributed to the marketing discourse and shaped the careers of many professionals. And from climbing out of career lows during recessions to navigating the challenges of the startup world, something I'm very familiar with, Colin's journey is a testament to resilience and strategic thinking. His expertise is not just confined to traditional marketing paradigms, but extends to the evolving digital and data-driven landscape, including the emerging field of retail media. I'm delighted to have him here to share his insights on the transformative role of retail media in shaping buyer-supplier relationships today as well. So Colin, welcome to the podcast.
Stuart, thank you very much for having me on. That was a very long intro. The best way to synopsize it for everybody here is I'm a career marketer whose side hustle has developed into the main hustle after 25 years.
So where did you start that career? Talk to me about that.
Well, I emigrated to Australia when I was in my 20s through a combination of circumstance and luck and perseverance, which I talk to people a lot about in careers thinking. I ended up as a marketing manager for Thomas Cook in Australia, and I was the head of the retail side. We had about 70 or 80 stores. And one of the things I had to do was negotiate and manage the supplier-buyer relationships. We were the retailer, and I negotiated with all the suppliers like your Qantas's, British Airways, Trafalgar's of this world. You know, there's echoes of what we're going to talk about today because we negotiated deals and there was lots of joint marketing through it. And I learned a lot. And as I found out later in life, it turns out many of those things are still usable and attributable years later.
So what year was that, dare I ask?
It was in the 90s.
90s. So you fast forward to when I
just at the starting point of the whole kind of ecom.com, that kind of period.
Yeah, sort of original retail media. Was that 20 odd years until 2011 when I joined and scaled the rest of it? Bit of quiz question for you then. What year was Thomas Cook founded?
He was founded in 1841, and the very first the reason why Thomas Cook is so famous is the very first actual package holiday was done by Thomas Cook, which was a train ride from the glamorous Leicester to even more glamorous Loughborough in the East Midlands of the UK.
The reason I asked, we started a creative and content agency. It took me ages to come up with the name and ultimately settled on the very name that 1841 on the back. He invented package travel. So actually he was the founder of travel, modern day package travel. Everything we talk about in travel today is directly linked to what Thomas Cook originally did around the world. And I mean, he was doing stuff in Egypt in the 1870s and doing stuff to Australia in the late 1880s. So he really was a pioneer, and it was also a great business. Great people. It was a real thing where I learned what culture really means in an organization. So tell us about your career path since, and how sort of that's now given you this expertise in retail media. Well, after Thomas Cook, I moved back to Europe and I started working in startup and technology firms who are quoted on the NASDAQ. So I really got to understand technology inside out, back to front. And in fact, I worked on a B2B e-commerce startup where we burnt through $70 million worth of venture capital over 3 years. That was interesting, and also a lesson in how what would then subsequently became kind of the Bibles of this world, around, minimum viable product, around lean thinking. Our chief exec didn't want any of that. And so that's why it ultimately led to an acquisition, but not a very successful firm. So back in the day, the whole startup world didn't really have the roadmaps that we have today and the Bibles that we could follow. Then I did an MBA, joined my two previous loves, which was travel and technology. And I was head of marketing for an airline across Europe, where we were doing 100 million in e-commerce as early as 2006. Then I worked for a company called 118 in the UK, but actually they have brands like that across Europe. We're spending about $25 million worth of money on TV. So I got really hands-on experience in TV production, but we also had a media business layered over every single market. So we actually sold calls, as in if you said, I'm looking for flowers or I'm looking for
say an Undertaker's, whatever, we sold those call numbers on. No different. Google sold the search numbers, and these businesses were doing millions a year in each market. And I managed the sales team for that, which was a real lesson in how to manage media people, because they're very, very different to most other people that one would hire. And I'm sure you know, Stuart. And then I worked for 3 or 4 years back again into travel, working for British Midland Airlines, doing the turnaround post-acquisition from British Airways. And then former bosses. In each case, I never really have to apply for jobs. It's just my previous bosses ring me up. I work for a B2B e-commerce technology company. We sold technology to enable ancillary revenue and media sales to be made to airlines around the world, such as British Airways, Sichuan Airlines, Cathay Pacific, as well as online travel agencies around the globe as well. And then over the last couple of years, I've been working for myself, obviously in partnership with other people, on e-commerce marketplace technologies. And what was my side hustle, as I like to say, outside of working full-time in jobs, I actually started teaching e-commerce marketing, digital marketing back as far as 2011. And I loved it. I still do that. And I also found out that I could write. So I ended up writing for Marketing Week magazine and writing a couple of best practice reports on marketplaces and e-commerce. And more recently, in the last year and a half, I've written 5 best practice reports on retail media. So for Walmart, Amazon, Kroger, Instacart, and Target. And then some people believe I'm quite articulate and can talk. So now I get invited to speak to the likes of Colgate or Barilla at their internal conferences around the globe about, guess what, marketing, e-commerce, marketplaces, and how this is going to change. In fact, my most recent fun one, I get carried away with my headlines sometimes, and I call my most recent one Everywhere All the Time. So it's a bit of fun doing what I do when I get up on stage.
So, and are you seeing those conversations with those marketers? Are you finding that retail media is, right up there now as a hot topic of conversation?
Yes, it's very much, obviously we all know why it's a hot topic, because it's been driven by the confluence of things such as the growth in e-commerce is one thing, and see people seeing their digital assets as monetizable. Number one. Number two, the capabilities around technology that didn't exist. Number three, obviously, I think it's now just under 400 days to the death of the cookie, according to Google. And then number 5, the realization that things like, particularly say, the margins that the retailers have are really non-tenable. They're not necessarily going up in the longer term. In fact, as an aside, Stuart, one of the things in my presentations, I just put a big screen of numbers, and the numbers are things like 2.4%, 3.1%, 3.4%, 3.2%, and 2.54%. And I asked people, what are these?
I was going to say, don't ask me.
And after a while, they realize what I'm trying to get. They are actually the margins of the major grocery retailers across Europe.
Are you seeing that?
The driver,
Because actually, where I found that once you've got C-suite buy-in, certainly from working inside retailers, that once you've got that, then things start to shift. Otherwise, you're constantly sort of pushing against, fears of cannibalization, fears of customer experience and things like that. But actually, ultimately, if you can balance those things, there is a huge amount of revenue to be had. But unless you get that C-suite buy-in, it's really difficult to, get people to do things, help you smooth the way, really. Are you finding now with your conversations with these bigger retailers that there is C-suite buy-in? Those guys are on board?
Well, very much so. And 100%, if the C-suite senior management don't buy in, then nothing happens. And I'm going to characterize it for your listeners into a couple of contexts here, which might help it frame it for them. So number one, retail media is not a thing that I flick the switch and it turns and the cash pours in like Niagara Falls. Like many opportunities, it requires a rethink of relationships, requires a rethink of certain processes, and it requires a bit more long-term thinking. It's not like, say, I'm opening up a new store, which is essentially an optimization capability, and I'm adding on. It's something completely different. It's a way of thinking. And secondly, then these things like sort of talking about, say, customer experience, or so on, or bottom of funnel, all these things. These are all people mistaking the thing that it's not for the real thing. Of course, one is going to look at customer experience. Of course, one is going to use it as a bottom of funnel thing. But in reality, and this is my real point, it's the trigger for a change in the nature of supplier relationships. And the chief execs who get that are the ones who are pushing it, and they understand that at an intimate level.
So how is it changing that buyer-supplier relationship, do you think?
feel it coming, and I was like, I better stop.
That's okay. So how do you think it is changing that buyer-supplier relationship?
Well, I go back to my original story when I was a little whippersnipper running the buyer-supplier relationships for Thomas Cook. And how do those discussions occur? We would meet them once a year. We would do joint business planning, and we would do a joint plan. We'd have a name. In our case, we call it the Thomas Cook Winner Plan. And then we would kind of meet regularly to kind of work out how those plans were being executed. And we use media channels. In that case, we were using print media, newspapers, radio, and of course, our own magazines as well. And one of the things that has happened over the last 5 or 10 years is that nothing has happened. In other words, those relationships are still the same. Whether you're a grocer or whether you're anything else, you still have your annual business plan that you meet with your retailer, with your supplier, and they can be sometimes combative or sometimes sort of needle driven rather than joint kind of like collaboration driven. I particularly noticed it over the last few years where I was working on an e-commerce capability project with a major US, global brand, but originally US. And what was very interesting when their discussions was how they thought about this world. They wanted to move from a situation where it was combative to where actually you were working together to grow the pie. And they were using a specific example of Walmart in the US and how they worked together with Walmart. And it was very much, I'll show you mine if you show me yours. They were having an integrated conversation around not just yearly business plans, but joint business plans. And the question really boiled down to was who was in the room. To summarize all that is that some people are still working in this kind of like combative trading framework, and others are moving to this kind of like strategic framework. In fact, that actual language I'm using there is what I do when I'm talking to both brands and retailers. I say there's a spectrum, and on one side of the spectrum, there's teams who are strategically thinking and seeing how the world of data, cookies, and technology is going to change that relationship. And the other end of the scale, we've got what I call the traders who just see buying and supplying anything to do with technology is an interruption to the world of trading, which is what retailing nominally is, but actually by definition will be changed to more of a technology-driven business, again, simply because the world is, in all cases, has to be mediated through technology, and buyer-supplier relationship is one of the last ones that has been.
Yeah, and how much of those, with those retailers, are you seeing that sort of brand spend start to shift there? So they are starting to put spend and except there are softer metrics beyond just sort of product sales they can be measured on. Certainly we see that when we start to introduce those things where we're still using all of that data, but bringing in creative solutions and more engaging solutions, that actually you create a set of softer metrics along with the hard ones that ultimately, actually build those relationships, exactly what you've just been talking about. Are we seeing much of that yet? Still just, retailers are still at the beginning of the journey, still putting the right sort of performance tech on their sites, or are we seeing anybody really stealing a march in that sort of full funnel stuff?
Well, in this case here, the US is kind of, if you will, stealing a march for a variety of reasons, because obviously scale, slightly different data rules to the US and UK, and their e-commerce scale is obviously phenomenal. So the US guys are kind of a little bit further ahead, but also what's further ahead than the UK, arguably, is Australia. What I've seen in New Zealand as well, some pretty advanced models. But in the UK, although there's a lot of retail media networks, there's only a couple doing it pretty well. Obviously, I'm kind of working with some of them, and I've seen some very impressive ones. For instance, but Sainsbury's and Tesco's are doing sort of very interesting ones. But for your listeners, what I would say is to think in terms of the classic flywheel phrase. So there's the flywheel of your business itself. So, there may be what your company is doing as a retailer to grow the brand, to grow traffic into the store, to grow traffic into the e-commerce site, which, grows the business overall and, improves product mix and so on. Though that sort of flywheel as one, and also develops logistics for delivery through e-commerce, all of those then in turn create the flywheel for retail media. Because if we're rising all boats through quality traffic, better e-commerce capabilities, and better to kind of, if you will, delivery options for customers, that helps then closer working relationships with suppliers. Why? Because you can give the suppliers more data as to what the customers are actually doing. It increases the level of inventory for sale, particularly in digital context. We can talk about in-store as well, which gives us better data, which enables us to put more creative solutions, which enables us to give better insights and come up with more innovation, which then spins the flywheel back into the original business. So there's a whole kind of subset of benefits from retail media that isn't just I'm selling these bottom funnel ad units.
Yes. Yeah, I totally agree with that. Are you seeing from that tech point of view that people are advanced? Are there still a lot still at the beginning of this journey?
It's a spectrum. I've met companies in Latin America who are way ahead of some brands in the UK. I've seen companies in Southeast Asia who are three or 4 years ahead of the UK. So it actually depends on your thinking around innovation, and also depends on who your role models are. So funnily enough, in Latin America, they see what Walmart are doing or Kroger are doing and Target are doing and try to sort of see what they can learn from that. In Southeast Asia, they're obviously looking at what Alibaba did with Tmall. I mean, for our listeners here, advertising in China is essentially digital advertising. So 75% of all media spend in China is digital. And what we're calling retail media on this call is essentially digital advertising is in China, because they operate within closed gardens of the likes of Tmall, the likes of Alibaba on the B2B side, or Pinduoduo on the sort of group buying side. And in fact, all of those, by the way, are marketplaces. China is not just the number one in e-commerce, it's also the number one in marketplaces. So there's a lot to learn from these folks. And that's why when we see what's happening, say, in the UK, part of the reason it might be behind is just simply because the existing business models are not kind of the same as how they are in the rest of the world, or the scale isn't there compared to the rest of the world.
So what about the impact of things like, you talked earlier about the cookie apocalypse. I hate that expression, but there it is. How are retailers preparing themselves for this? Are they prepared?
Well, I'm going to do a phenomenal set of name dropping right now. So I've been in Cannes and Chicago in the last few weeks, where I was speaking at a few events around retail media and attending a few as well to make sure I'm kind of like tuning into what people are saying. And there was people from all over the world in these here. One of the speakers was from Google, and they said, the cookie apocalypse, we're deprecating the cookie in under 400 days. So that was 2 weeks ago. So that makes that, 380 days. We then got a chat over a coffee going, who is actually planning around this? And my answer is nobody. And the reason why nobody is because most people are not thinking about the world in terms of 2 years' time. I used to work in the airline business, and the line we used by team is long term is next quarter, midterm is next month, short term is today. That's how you have to think in the world of a retailing business. Airlines are like retailers as well, because you cannot go plan for next year because you're too busy trying to make today's numbers. Now, of course, it's going to become front and center, and it'll start dawning on people probably early next year that the plans they put in place to do X, Y, Z, ABC, particularly around performance marketing, isn't quite going to be where it's at. So although we're still on I'm not sure where it's a cricket analogy or a baseball analogy, we're still in first innings. There's still a long way to go. So I'm going to really trash my metaphors here, but we're not even at the end of the first day in a 5-day test.
It'd be interesting to see, actually, because often retail media organizations within retailers would lean on the marketing organization and potentially sometimes the media agency within there. Given those retailers that sell a lot of audience extension, it'll be interesting to see whether actually the necessity of not seeing that revenue fall off a cliff might accelerate how they're dealing with that with data clean rooms and things like that, versus the actual brand itself that might just be reliant on its media agency to solve the problem. It'll be interesting to see how that dynamic works.
What I've seen, and kind of to a certain extent of what we've advised is, and then got people to implement, is your ad agency can't solve this for you. You've kind of got to tune into where your data is sitting, how you're currently acquiring your customers, what channels you're doing, and then think about it in a wider context, because obviously your suppliers also have kind of skin in the game as well. So your suppliers, let's say I'm working with a big brand, they're trying to sell using Google, Facebook, whatever it may be, these kind of cookie-driven environments. They're also trying to sell through you as a retailer. But the former is going to radically change. And if the retailer hasn't kind of tuned into how that cookie is going to actually radically change the nature of their own business, well, then they've got a problem. So it actually will require buyers and suppliers to come together. One of the things, which is I haven't seen as much, but I can tell you what I've seen in the US. So the retailers, the ad agencies in the UK, I can see what their problem is. There's nothing in it for them at the moment, retail media. There is, because the reason is the majority of retail media in both the US and UK is Amazon advertising. And if you're a business that is, let's say a performance-based ad agency, where your bread and butter is AdWords, Facebook, whatever, Snap, it doesn't really matter. Whatever your bread and butter is, TikTok, you can earn a margin by the fact that your brands or retailers have outsourced their customer acquisition, customer conversion, customer retention to you. Great, no problem. However, they don't have the capability to understand Amazon advertising because it's a whole new world. And the world of retail media, it will be perceived the scale is not there. So why should I go and do it? Because the money is not there. And also the world of off-site advertising is only nascent. Whereas in the US, I know this because I met some of them directly last week. There's big agencies like Starcom and so on who have full retail media teams who are buying media on Kroger, on Albertsons, on Target, on Amazon at scale with, full amount of people, sort of like people have in the UK with AdWords. So it's going to be a very interesting, bumpy ride over the next couple of years for the agencies.
Been an amazing evolution, that, because, we talked earlier about the buyer-supplier relationship. And actually, I think that's one of the challenges agencies always have, is that typically the retail media is bought between that buyer and supplier because it's a co-marketing plan and they work out, right, how many product sales am I going to sell? And then what you're doing when you're asking a media agency is to try and get involved in that. And that media agency is typically a planner buyer who has absolutely no understanding of a retailer or how retail works or that buy and supply relationship. And suddenly you're crowbarring somebody in there who's trying to talk about media metrics and this sort of thing. And, there is that education required, but it's hard for them.
It's like any business has to go and say, where's the money? Show me the money. And in this case here, it's kind of tricky for them to do so. And as you point out, and it's actually something I write a lot about, which is, by definition, advertisers have to be good at strategy, planning, buying, audiences, all that sort of good stuff. And by definition, marketers and retailers don't have to understand that stuff, but they do have to know how a store works, how an airline works, how these things are put together. Never the twain shall meet. And, sort of anecdotally, obviously having run major e-commerce websites and sites and run airlines and retail kind of marketing for years, I can see why the agencies don't understand it, and what they layer over it with their thinking is just typically often not applicable. Yeah. My major bugbear in life is people telling me that airlines are in the travel business, and I keep telling them airlines are not in the travel business, and that's kind of like heretical to say. But no matter how often I tell people airlines are not in the travel business, they just can't, it doesn't sink in. There's just like, that's not the business. The business is not a travel business. And they're like, but I go on holidays on an airline. I say, yeah, but you drive a car. That doesn't make you a Formula One driver. They're just two different things.
So ultimately, tell me, you've obviously written your books on e-commerce best practice and marketplaces best practice. And retail media, there's your plug. What do you think in your mind is a best practice sort of formula for retail media if retailers are looking to sharpen or start their own retail media business?
Well, the first thing is the mindset. And the mindset is to say, if it's a money grab that I think I can go and do something overnight and get loads of cash in, well, I would tell you to stop now, because it's not going to work. Because you're going to start as I like to use to say, you're going to open the first store. And then by the time you get to the 10th door, you're going to realize I'm not in Kansas anymore. I'm doing something completely different. So it's not a cash grab. It has to be started with what are we trying to do? What assets have we got in place? So the first asset you've got in place is, what channels am I open in, starting with e-commerce? Does it have adequate traffic to monetize? Can I layer a piece of technology, ad tech technology over that to sell those, turn those into individual pieces of inventory that can be sold on a CPC or a CPM basis? So that's the first thing. The second thing then is what are the other kind of assets that I need to make that happen? So besides getting the technology up and running, the second thing they need to do is realize that, just like I talked to the airline business, they're in the seat selling business and not the travel business. Once you get into the game, I'm setting up a retail media business, you're definitely no longer in Kansas. You're actually selling media, and selling media is a very different business to selling vegetables, as very crudely. It's just a different game. Okay. It's just, it's not merchandising. It's not getting customers in store. It's a very, very different business. And so recognize that. I'll come back to the media sales piece. Okay. Recognize that. Then the third piece is that in order for that to happen, you've got to have audiences based on your traffic. or AKA data and insight. And so if you don't have those capabilities built out, you very quickly have to start building out your audiences and insights for your suppliers. And only then can you start thinking about, hey, Mr. Supplier, we've got this cool piece of retail media setup. How can we kind of work with you to make this happen? And as soon as that sort of door is opened, the suppliers will then say, I need better data. I need to know my conversion rates. I need to know what I'm getting for my results. Now, that is then the trigger for sort of deer in the headlights for many retailers. So this is point number 5, which is that just like me, when I was a little whippersnapper working for Thomas Cook, I may have not told the whole truth and nothing but the truth to my suppliers about their sales results and the money they had co-invested in us. Now, why did I not tell the whole truth and nothing but the truth? Because I, didn't have the data, couldn't get it together. The campaign was a disaster. And both scenarios made me look like a fool. Now, in both cases, it turns out that's still the case today. So when I talk to retailers, I'm still on point number 5 here. When I talk to retailers now, I say, are you giving your suppliers the data? And they say one of 2 answers. A, I don't have the data, or B, it was a dog anyway, and I don't want to look like a fool. So how do we move? So now we're getting into point 6. It turns out this is going to require culture change for the retailer. So starting out with hey, I just want to monetize my B2B assets very quickly turns into, I've got to change my culture as an organization from potentially combative relationship with my suppliers to actually, we're no longer combative. We're actually going to share and pool notes. So number 7 then is, if you buy into that concept, you're then going to have to set up more tools and technologies to enable that to happen. And they include things like clean room technologies. If you're not clear on those, you should look at search what Amazon Marketing Cloud are doing. But essentially is the definitive kind of clean room model where we take pseudonymized data from the supplier and the buyer, compare them and see what the results are by category, by product, by market, by audience. And that's actually where we're all going to, whether we like it or not. The Amazon Marketing Cloud model is the sort of metaphor for the future. And the most powerful retailer in the world, who's more or less everywhere, is actually Amazon, at least in the Western world. And they are selling this Amazon Marketing Cloud to everybody. And the suppliers know this. And when the suppliers see what it can do, and also see what Walmart Luminate can do, they then look at their existing retailers, or probably like a large percentage of their turnover, going, they can do this. We know it works. Why can't you do this? So that's point number 7. And my final point, which is we start off thinking it's one thing, and in the end, we have to turn ourselves into joint business plan, built organizations where we're sharing data together to grow the category and create value for the customer.
You're absolutely right across all those things. And that mindset thing and the pace that you can move at in a retail media organization is also slightly dictated by the size of the organization that you're trying to change. So I always used to liken it to us when we were at Thomas Cook being in a speedboat and trying to pull an oil tanker, but the oil tanker wants to go in the other direction.
That's okay. I never have any criticism of that because organizations are who they are. Changing incentives is a very, very hard thing to do. I've been involved in, even in Thomas Cook, actually, back in the day, in a big change management programs. They take a while. We always what I used to find was it would take 3 years, no matter how good you were and no matter how aligned everybody was.
How could retailers now prepare? You were talked about the media sales piece earlier and that buyer-supplier relationship. How can retailers now prepare for that cultural change or the people change that's required inside in order to maximize this?
Well, retailers to a certain extent are getting a message from the past to help them do this. So let's say up to 2015, 16, many retailers operated as they would have done even 50 years ago, which is selling of merchandise, what's happening in store, creating excitement and experiences in store. And probably the big differences would have been the use of supply chain technologies and delivery technologies. But obviously since then, we've had the growth of pure e-retailer, e-commerce for retailers. That is essentially a new business compared to what happens in store. And e-commerce requires completely different thinking to how things operate in store, because obviously everything is mediated through a screen and we're dealing in a world of algorithms and abstractions rather than, say, fruit and veg that I can pick up in my hand, which is where many traders would have come, many retailers would have come from. So the e-commerce game actually trained retailers to kind of think through the world through a different lens. That sure, it wasn't quite like opening a new store, but it definitely opened up brand new distribution and then brand new opportunities in terms of skills and capabilities in terms of acquisition and retention. So just like that, retail media is another opportunity to go and say we're building out a different set of capabilities, but that capabilities are built on actually how the future will run. And, one of the things in my kind of keynotes, I go and say this, like, is there, and in fact, I've written about this as well, which is there any version of the future where you think there will not be more technology and more layers of technology? You're in denial if you think so. Kevin Kelly, in his book, The Inevitable, talks about the 12 things that are going to inevitably happen because one thing leads on to another. He wrote it before the rollout of ChatGPT 6 months ago, but he did talk a little bit about AI. And it's very clear, exponential technologies enable companies to scale massively without tons of investment. And cloud infrastructure enables you to do so. Exponential technologies enable you to capture lots of data and to use that data to create benefit for shoppers and buyers. Now AI layered on top of that enables you to not even just scale products, but also scale customer service, scale marketing exponentially as well. We're talking about retailers are by definition going to move from traders who are buying and selling fruit and veg or whatever it may be, clothes, to where they are powered by data, technology, artificial intelligence, and so on, because that is an inevitable way of the future. And one tool, one kind of capability within all that is retail media, which also has one added benefit, which is if you get it right, everything is an ad network, as Seifert writes, and you can then scale that also exponentially, but you're getting into a new game. And it's this new game piece that people don't cop on straight away and then eventually go right. And that then undermines the previous 50 years we've all had of trade marketing. And so trade marketing selling products that solve shoppers' problems. Whereas trade marketing, God forbid I'm saying this live on a podcast, but maybe trade marketing wasn't used to market products. Maybe it was just used to go straight to the bottom line. I know I've heard rumors, but I can neither say nor deny that I've seen such things happening, but I might have done it myself in the past. So that kind of listing fees and all this sort of stuff, when you have things mediated by technologies, that game has to change.
But how do you think AI is going to impact retail, aside from what you've just talked about?
One has to look at what AI can do. What it really can do is do things at scale, do things that were previously menial, such as customer service and so on. I'm not one of these like people who pontificate about how the future is going to be. I only talk about things that I think are inevitable. And people will, just like in year 2000, when I first started working in technology, we knew that pets.com was a dog of a business, but that you could sell dog food over the internet, and now it's very successful. And also that you could sell airline tickets over the internet, but it wasn't very good, and then it became very successful. I think we can see little kind of glimpses like that right now of the future, which is artificial intelligence can improve customer service, can improve choice, can improve ability of customers, can reduce actual headcount doing a menial task, but we don't know how. It can also improve ways to communicate, either through marketing or through content or through visuals. So they're all very much nascent, but that's where we're going to go to. Just like in 2000, we knew it was nascent, but we couldn't figure out how it was going to turn out.
I agree with that. It'd be interesting to see how its impact on aggregators, actually, because ultimately all they're doing is bringing lots of different products, or the same products from multiple places into one place.
Well, one thing I've always been kind of like down on aggregators, like, how the hell does this work? But actually what aggregators were able to do, and I'm including, back to my first love, travel, booking.com and, Expedia, and even for that matter, Skyscanner. What they did was, if you will, game the customer acquisition system. So Booking and Expedia spent 10.6 billion, I think, purely on Google AdWords. And most recently I checked again in 2022, they'd upped that spend to 12 billion. So essentially they do arbitrage, which is they know how to make this work. They got incredible amount of data science and they got very big budgets. So they layer themselves in between the consumer and the ultimate supplier of the product, which in this case is airlines and so on, or hotels. And so even though I think aggregators won't have a future, they always find a way, good for them. One final one I want to talk about is newer models come through that, I suppose great business a very interesting business, I should say, in Germany, Austria, and the Czech Republic when I was speaking at a conference recently. And they call Rolik, or OHLIK. And they do, guess what? Fresh food delivery. And because it was built from ground zero, as in, went from zero to I've got a business up and running. They built the retail media capabilities in from day one, and in fact, built their own ad tech. And they had a couple of really, really interesting concepts going on. And this is an example of where innovation is coming that we didn't think of, powered by artificial intelligence. All the trucks and vans are electric powered. And their motto is this, which is like, do you want the groceries? You go to the grocery store and deliver. Your Stuart's going to do his shopping, and Colin's going to do his shopping, and Mary's going to do their shopping, and Betty's going to do their shopping. So there's like 10 sets of cars drive to the grocery store, and we all pack our car and then we drive home. Or B, do you want an electric vehicle to do all that shopping for you and deliver with no emissions and no traffic, with the actual routing chosen through artificial intelligence to maximize the opportunity, with the call time, drop-in time, monitored through artificial intelligence and through what suits you as well. You can kind of see a glimpse of the future there, which is how things can pan out once you have a ground zero kind of approach to life. And so that's kind of where I see the future, which is existing businesses redone from a clean slate.
Actually, we've got a couple of clients now who are launching new site. It's a pleasure to deal with because we can actually but work through with them how that retail media operation looks from the start, and everyone's aligned, and there's nobody saying a site and on the go that then being cannibalized, or you have to A/B test, and that it's all from the off. So
innovation, or they call it, Joseph Schumpeter called it creative destruction, is actually going to be another thing that's going to come up on the side that we're not expecting.
Tell me a bit more about that.
Well, back in the 1940s, there was an Austrian economist called Joseph Schumpeter. And one of his key kind of points in his book is how innovation waves occur is not through layering over existing things. It comes through what's called creative destruction, where new innovations and new technologies come on and kind of blow away the past. And for our listeners, it's understanding destruction. Destruction is a bit of a harsh word, but that's not what he means. He kind of says, well, there's a lot of newer opportunities that create. Now, we all know this because most people listening on this call probably can remember 25, 30 years ago, and many businesses don't exist from 25, 30 years ago. And that's an example of creative destruction. There's plenty of retailers who went bust in the last 10 years. That's an example of creative destruction. But big difference, say, compared to 20, 30 years ago, is the speed driven through exponential technologies and driven through exponential capabilities. So, Stuart and myself arguably could spin up a retailer through using Shopify and, getting some payment mechanisms aboard, getting some suppliers aboard through a wholesaler. Well, give or take, we could have the Shopify side up in half an hour. You have payment mechanisms up in an hour or two, and we're in business. Getting the supply might be tricky, and getting the delivery might be tricky, but arguably we could be up and running within a month without some huge capital cost. Whereas if Stuart and I were going to set up a retailer on the high street, first of all, we'd have to do a lease, and then we'd buy that lease, and the lease would be for 20 years. Then we'd have to go and fill out the store. Then we'd have to get payment terms, and we wouldn't get payment terms. So we'd actually have to fund every single product ourselves out of cash. And then we'd be signed to a 20-year lease, and we still have no customers. And then we have to hire staff. We still have no customers. And then we've got a marketing program. We still have no customers. So you see see that chasm between the two. Yeah. And so that's why people still, you see these, well, I'm going to be rude on your show. You see a lot of people talking about how e-commerce is flatlined, e-commerce is dead. And the correct answer for those people is morons, okay? Because they can't actually see how e-commerce completely changes the business model of retail. If we have, and by the way, we have a model for this already, and it's called commercial real estate. So commercial real estate right now is on a major problem. Why? Because they built these massive assets that people are no longer going to because of hybrid work. 2-3 days a week will not make you pay for your £1 billion mortgage. If we take the same thing with retailing, which do you want? Do you want to open up a shopping mall, out of town that costs billions to build, needs to be filled full of staff and have lots of attractions to get people there? Or B, do you want to set up, Lewis and Adamson retailers, run it from a very cheap warehouse using cheap technologies and deliver exactly the same experience, but online? There is only one answer, Stuart. Yeah. That's why e-commerce is barely started. We're actually in the Web 1 was the original phase of the web in the 2000s. Web 2.0 was obviously the rise of social media, and we're now about to do Web 3, and it's going to make the other one look like kindergarten.
I think if we did set up a retailer, we wouldn't need a warehouse because it'd be in travel.
Well, I think that's a really good point. But the rules don't apply in many cases on services. It's kind of interesting. You hear a lot on marketing talk about how we shouldn't discount. I'm like, well, if there's no cost of delivery and it's a marginal cost of delivery, you can discount all you like. And people can't tune into this because they still live in this world of, hard products rather than abstractions and algorithms, which is essentially what e-commerce and marketplaces are.
Look, I think we're sort of slightly over time, but I've just, absolutely loved talking to you, Colin. I think it's been an absolutely brilliant pod. So thank you for coming in. But maybe one last question around innovation. You talked just then a lot about innovation. What are the big innovation trends? What's going to happen now in retail media over the next few years?
Well, the first one is people will start really realizing what they can do with their data and the audiences around that. Number one. Number two, the trigger from Cannes a few weeks ago from Google was where they're basically saying we're not getting involved in retail media. What we're going to do is use extensions, audience extensions. And what's one of those audience extensions? Search. What's the big one? YouTube. And so what we're going to find is brands going, hold on a second, I can advertise my products on YouTube match to audiences from a retailer rather than going to ITV and spend mega money on, advertising the ITV news. That is a complete game changer. That's obviously tied in with connected TV. Yeah. And then number 3 will be capabilities of brand building offsite, which the one I've just described there, but also other channels as well. That's what's going to happen. It's a 100% guarantee because the current way of marketing brands through expensive TV ads with massive production costs is only selected few, and the future belongs to democratization of technologies and democratization of products.
Absolutely. And it's exactly where we're seeing our clients, what we're doing for our clients, exactly those 3 things, which is good to know, quite validating. Listen, Colin, it's been amazing to meet a kindred travel spirit and a retailer. So it just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed for taking the time out of your busy schedule to join our Retail Media Moguls podcast. It'd be great if you come back at some point, come and see how maybe in a few months or a bit longer and just see how things are developed. And we can talk again and look back maybe at some of these themes we've talked about today and see how they've evolved.
Well, I'd love to do that. I'm actually visiting another 5 or 6 countries between now and the end of the year, including go back to Australia and New Zealand. So I'll have more news then to talk about what's happening around the world. Fantastic. Well, we'd love you to come back. So look, thank you again. Thank you for taking the time. We really appreciate it. And we'll see you back here again soon. Thanks a lot, Stuart. And thanks a lot for everybody having me on. The Retail Media Moguls podcast is brought to you by Platform 195. To learn more about Platform 195 and how to connect retail media with intelligent marketing to accelerate growth, visit platform195.com. And then make sure to search for Retail Media Moguls in Apple Podcasts, Spotify and Google Podcasts, or anywhere else podcasts are found. Make sure to click subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And on behalf of the team here at Platform 195, thanks for listening.